I'm going to start, if I may, with, I think, a hot, sexy topic, and I'm going to ask Gavin Irwin to talk about that. Gavin is going to talk about bribery and corruption, particularly the Bribery Act in the UK. So, for example, you're an entrepreneur, you're brilliant, you're a genius, you've invented the first car in the world, you're going to sell it now to some market. And your local man or woman says, hey, look, we're going to sell 100,000 mobiles, but the local custom here is to, the local guy needs, a sweetener. And you say, oh, I'm very sorry, what's a sweetener? And then you're told what's a sweetener. The issue arises, are you then capable to be prosecuted for that sweetener? So without much more ado, can I ask my dear colleague and brother and friend and ingenious lawyer, my dear friend Gavin Irwin, to first introduce himself slowly and then tell us the answer to that question.
Very well. So to introduce myself slowly but briefly, thank you, Michel. We're not really lawyers, we're disruptive entrepreneurs as well. We bestride the earth, frightening the unwary, creating anxiety and panic, and then selling the solution. So we too are disruptive entrepreneurs. What I wanted to talk about this morning was this notion of compliance convergence. So rather than dealing separately with anti-bribery and corruption, anti-money laundering, export licensing and sanctions, and all the issues that businesses have to be aware of, if they're not going to fall foul of the law, not going to end up in litigation with competitors, not going to end up at the final analysis before a criminal court, of course, the awful scenario. How do you avoid these things? Well, first of all, it can seem initially like having to have or having to comply with a whole raft of regulations in these different areas can be an enormous bureaucratic burden. But in fact, it could be seen, again, we've heard some speakers this morning talking about the flip side to the always dwelling on the negatives. In fact, if one thinks of it as just a facet of risk management, managing your brand, managing your identity, managing reputational risks, and of course avoiding the awful consequences in the final analysis. So how do you go about these things? Well, you have to be aware of what they are in the first place. We all have notions as to what bribery and corruption are. They are in fact defined in law. And you ought to be aware that not only can an individual be prosecuted for bribery and corruption, but that corporate entities can be prosecuted for having failed to prevent bribery. So all businesses have to have, however big or small, have to have systems and procedures in place to ensure that this doesn't happen. Now, if you're a small business, a startup, and your exposure to the risk is very low or very limited, then of course you don't have to do a great deal, but you have to at least have thought about it. If the exposure is minimal, then you can move on and deal with the startups and so on, and trying to increase the value of your business. But you have to have thought about these issues. What happens if you are dealing with other businesses in exposed sectors? What are exposed sectors? Well, they might be thought of as extractive industries, pharmaceuticals, military contracting, and so on. I don't know if everyone in the room is thinking about doing a software startup or is developing apps for existing hardware technologies. But if you're involved in anything else other than that, then you might be in a position where you need to consider these issues. And more recently, I've been dealing with people who have been developing software applications which have an element of cryptography built into them. So not weaponized cryptography, not trying to match the Chinese security service in wiliness in terms of what you can do and get round and prevent others from seeing or break into other people's kit, but rather just software that has a cryptographic element. If you're exporting that to Russia or Nigeria, you may be in some difficulties, and I've been trying to assist companies with that. So the critical things that you have to do, what do you have to do? You have to record your decision making, you have to have performed a risk analysis, and you have to do ongoing monitoring review on the due diligence that you have performed. Now, we can talk a little bit more in detail, but I would imagine I've spoken for long enough and that others will want to...
Not enough, we love you. But
okay.
We give it a chance. I'm going to call my colleague and friend Michael Paulin, who is a barrister practicing from One Crown Office Row. He is a specialist in tax litigation and tax avoidance, including judicial review of challenges of the Income Tax Department. Michael spent some time working with Lord Dyson. In addition to being a great lawyer, I'm privileged. He's been my mini pupil for a while, but also he's a great actor. He is a Shakespearean actor of note. So please give a big warm welcome to my dear friend, Michael.
Well, hello everyone. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm certain that I cannot live up to that introduction. And I want to reassure you all that I'm not going to walk the boards or embark upon my desire to recite various monologues.
To be or not to be, no?
Yes, indeed. My relationship with Michel goes back many years. As Michel says, I did a mini pupillage with Michel. I remember fondly being at the British Library following a talk given by the late, great Edward Said. And I met Michel. I was introduced to Michel by my father. And Michel said, yes, you must come and do a mini pupillage with me, but you need to lose the hip-hop haircut because you look more like one of my clients than a barrister. So I've grown my hair. My musical tastes haven't changed. But so very good to be here. Just really want to follow on and discuss broadly the framework, the broad regulatory framework, and how it's developing and evolving in business terms, particularly for everyone here in terms of international business. As Michel notes, and it was interesting to hear about the French Civil Code and its static nature, we've seen, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, the rise and continued rise of the English common law. For example, in Dubai, we have the DIFD, and it follows, of course, the English common law, and the Qatari courts are the same. And what the UK Parliament has tried to do is embark on a sort of legislative exercise that seeks essentially to create a kind of series of overlapping Venn diagrams that, in regulatory terms, cover the sorts of risks that the speakers have referred to in this session and previously. One recent piece of legislation in that respect is the Criminal Finances Act 2017, which complements the points my colleagues made about bribery and particularly the Bribery Act. And there are a number of points really in that respect. I hasten to add that there's probably nothing, the only thing that might be more boring than talking to a lawyer is hear a lawyer talk about the law. So I'm not going to regale you with the fine detail of the various legislative positions, other than to say that really what we're looking at, I would say, are two really main developments that overlap and cut across questions of international tax, bribery, and broad regulatory compliance. And those are the increased focus on corporate liabilities. That's something that, everyone here needs to consider when they're doing business. They need to consider the fact that, for example, there is now specific provision for the failure to prevent tax evasion offences, and that being a corporate failing and corporate question. And secondly, the increased information gathering powers of HMRC and the fact that those who are facing such inquiries need to be proactive and progressive in dealing with them. That said, it may well be that in this post-Brexit era, the only thing we have to export is the English common law. Whether that is true or not remains to be seen. But certainly there is a considerable flexibility, and it's very much the case that notwithstanding these overlapping regulatory obligations and requirements, we are, at least today, still open for business. And I could make many jokes about Brexit. I'm resisting the urge to do so, not least because Je suis calisthenics are here, and I was very much interested to read their leaflet, which was a happy event in talk about business, to read people focusing on health and fitness. And I said that I would refer to them for no other reason than that.
Brilliant.
So
Thank you, Michael.
I hope that covers what I want to say.
To begin with. Thank you, Michael. My next panelist and colleague is Laura Berton. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Brilliant. Thank you for that. She was brought up in Belgium and UK. She's a high-powered solicitor and has been awarded a major award called the Rising Star Award. She has got so many qualifications. My eyes are bad, I can't read them all. But she has been a very powerful international lawyer in commercial IP and an IT lawyer, and is a partner in one of the leading London firms. Can you add to that and then hit your subject, which is IT law?
Thank you, Michel. I'm not going to be like the guy saying it's too much. Thank you. I'm just grateful for the intro, so thank you very much.
I charge more for more.
There's so much to do. I don't know how much I've been given the last 45 minutes. Next 45 minutes, right?
If you're, well, of course, if you want.
Because
I think the idea is a 5 minutes intro, and then we open it. And
Okay.
then you can,
Okay. Well, I shall hide my enthusiasm because, of course, I do think that IP, which is what I'm going to talk to you about, is the most important thing for you guys. Not that my other legal colleagues do not have very relevant subject matter, but the fact is, most entrepreneurs nowadays have an idea. You don't have factories, you don't have stuff, you have an idea. And you have IP, and that's what you sell, and that's why it's important to protect it, because otherwise you don't have anything. You don't have a business, you don't have tax to pay or people to bribe. Hence the relevance. So also, I'd like to touch on a point. I'm a solicitor, so the reason why you come and see me or one of my colleagues is not to go and see a barrister. Because when you go and see a barrister, you've done something wrong. So basically, what we try to do is to help people get it right in the beginning, in the first place. Is that how solicitors, barristers work?
Absolutely not. Do go on.
I have to be fair, so I won't answer.
Sometimes people come and see me because they've done things right. It happens. It does happen.
So I think when you start, so what I do is I'm a tech commercial lawyer, which means that I do software licensing, software development, outsourcing agreement, procurement, bit of privacy. And I also act as a GC for startups. So a lot of startups don't have a in-house legal capacity because they're not at the stage where they can afford it, nor do they need it. However, they do need the legal support. And I genuinely believe, although I sound a bit like a geek, that it's fundamental when you set up a business, if you intend this business to grow, that you have the foundations in place. And the foundations in place will mean, there's all the corporate stuff, which, I find a bit boring, but you need to do, which is, where do you set up, what kind of company do you set up, what structure, shareholders agreements and investment. This is all things you need. It's very important. But the next stage after you actually set up what the business shape is going to be like is, what is your idea? What's the business? And there are many ways to protect your business in terms of brand, in terms of brand protection, trademarks, in terms of copyright, potentially patents. Then you have the contractual layer, and the contractual layer works in two ways. It's whatever you buy to make sure that you have the rights to whatever you develop, and what you sell to make sure you don't give away what you've spent 3 years developing. So a lot of it you can actually do yourself without needing a lawyer, but what you need is an IP strategy. And it's really, the IP strategy is really going back to the basics. What is the idea? What's the know-how? What is it that you sell? What is it that you need to keep? And then to go through the different things that you can do on your own. So, 20 years ago, if I'd ask you what are the most famous brands you'd be talking about brands like Coca-Cola, or maybe Manchester United. Everyone knows them in the world. I think they're about the biggest thing. And these are brands that would have been built for years. And now, if you look at the biggest brands, they're brands that literally have appeared over the last few years. So, for example, Uber. About 4 years ago, I think when Uber started, I started having children, just 2, but back to back, so that's not a long time. And suddenly, so I wasn't going out, right? So I was babies and suddenly I wake up and everyone's saying, do you have Uber? Did you call an Uber? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And it seems that actually the Uber generation, took over because I wasn't there. But it took, a year? And everyone knew about it. So you go back to brand, domain names, trademarks straight away. Because it can develop and spread through social media so fast. Okay, that's my intro.
Thank you very much. Now, to follow this discussion, the idea, I think, Gavin, is to see if we can pose some questions. I want to ask you, Gavin, take the classic case of countries where gifts are acceptable, are in fact required. Some countries, I'm not going to mention it, say, it will be considered an insult if you come in to do even a simple business if you don't buy them lunch or give them a small present, nicely wrapped. I'm thinking of certain countries, for example.
Yes.
Where does the gift become a bribe? So can you just deal with that?
Well, it's impossible to draw a line and say beyond this line bribe, below that line acceptable gift, because it depends on context and circumstance. So depending on lots of features like the place you are in the world, the geography, the business, the sector that you're in, if that sector in that part of the world is endemically bribable or bribing, then you have to be more careful. So you have to set your radar to sensitive. And once you're then in the space where gifts may be offered, and they may be very valuable gifts, then you maybe have to start paying more attention. But is there a monetary amount? Absolutely not. A Rolls-Royce car is very different from a bottle of whiskey. Don't worry about the bottle of whiskey. Worry much more about the Rolls-Royce.
I mean, I don't know if you follow the news, I'm sure you have, that a certain head of state received a gold gun. How does that fit in your charter of?
I didn't realise Scaramanga was a head of state. Yeah, I mean, a golden gun. This is
not
difficult.
gold.
If it's a
24
gift,
karat gold.
if it's a gift from a head of state to a head of state,
That's okay.
Then there isn't any commercial transaction involved.
How do you
with it,
know?
and nobody has to be concerned.
I see.
Yeah. Or here's a treaty signed, and here are the businesses that are following on the back of the treaty, or whatever it is, whatever a bilateral is. But that's not something that we need to concern ourselves with. But if it's business
there may be
to
heads of
business,
state coming up. What do you mean?
if it's business to business, then yes, a golden gun is likely to be a problem.
Right, okay.
And the more solid, the more carrots in the gold, the more problematic it is.
Michael, I want you to, everybody knows, but I just want you to highlight a little bit in your tax area. People talk about avoidance of tax and evasion of tax. Can you just simplify it a little bit so we can appreciate that, and where is legal, where is illegal, and so on?
Yeah, certainly. I think probably for the people here and the sorts of issues that those entrepreneurs are likely to come across will be where you've put together a deal, or you've put together a series of transactions that have involved an international element, and the questions that you need to sort of ask yourself there, as well as the normal ones about where your primary place of business is, where your permanent establishment is, and whether or not you need to structure yourself in whatever is the best way for your business. One of the questions you have to ask yourself is where you consider you ought to pay tax. And you'd be surprised at how complex that question can become when a business develops, grows, and moves with the sort of speed that we've seen. For example, in the case of Uber, although they seem to be quite well advised, and so but I think your average black cabbie has a lot to say about where Uber pays tax. If it happens, I don't know. But certainly, one of the points to sort of think about is your strategy. Where are you going to base yourself? Why? What sort of jurisdiction are you looking at? Why? And how are you going to operate in the most effective way? And those questions ideally should be asked at the very beginning of any
But Michael, is tax avoidance legal? I mean, to ask a serious question becomes a joke, for Christ's sake.
So there was this sort of broad brush distinction which was fashionable some years ago, 10 or a decade ago, if not more, between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax avoidance was, until quite recently, seen by many members of the senior judiciary as a kind of vanilla term that simply concerns the legitimate structuring of one's affairs in the most tax-efficient way. And Lord Hoffman, for example, was prone to philosophical pronouncements from his seat in the House of Lords as a judge about how it is legitimate for any taxpayer to organise their affairs in the most tax-efficient way, and while the revenue HMRC may regard that as tax avoidance, it was lawful and the like. And there was then a kind of hard-edged criminal question of tax evasion, which simply meant not paying your tax when it was due and evading your obligations in the criminal sense. What's happened basically over the past decade is the concept of tax avoidance, both politically and legally, has taken on a new shape. And the legislation now is complex and structured to tackle tax avoidance. So you have, for example, the DOTAS rules, the Disclosure of Tax Avoidance Scheme rules, which some might think ironic, it make it necessary for taxpayers when they are signing up to a tax avoidance scheme to notify HMRC of that, and they're actually given a reference number. So we are in a very, very new landscape in that respect. Tax avoidance now is very much in the firing line in terms of the legislation, in terms of HMRC's approach, and there are a whole series of overlapping liabilities, risks and challenges in that respect, which I could bore you all by going into great depths about. But I think the point I'd make comes back to the point that my colleagues have touched upon, which is essentially concerning the commercial reality of what it is that you're doing. And that has to be the first and foremost question you ask yourself, who am I, what am I for? And I hesitate to mock up Shakespeare in what I'm about to say, but the challenge is always to ask yourself, what is my business and what do I do? And really, if that question's asked properly, whether it's from an international regulatory law perspective, from a criminal liability perspective, for an IP perspective, the answers ought to follow. And that's why people come and see me when they get it right, because I sort of smile and generally
just to congratulate.
Yeah,
you.
just
Michael,
I just
thank you
smile.
for that. Laura, can you just expand a little bit on this area? How would you say and describe the value of IP? Why is it important to have? Why should you protect IP and your brand?
So just to continue to give a bit more detail on my long introduction on why that was really essential. So you go back to really, I always think take a step back and go back to the basics. And I hate it when people make things very complicated. I think they do it on purpose just to confuse everyone. You don't need this. You just need to understand. And so we always go back with our clients and go back and think, what is the vision that you have? And I think we've heard the word before quite a bit, but what's the vision? What do you want to do? What's the aim? And that's used not only to design your business strategy, but within the business strategy, the IP strategy. And the IP is basically everything that you know, everything that you develop, every process, every way of doing things. So what you have to understand is what you have now, what you intend to develop, what you intend to sell, and how the business works. And once you've really understood this, then you can look at the different ways of protecting this. So a lot of you would have heard about patents, but this is quite an expensive way to be able to protect a limited type of intellectual property. And it's great, and you do need to register for patents, but again, it's not the cheapest way. So if you look at the basics and the cheap way, you'd have the brand. So trademarks, for example. You can have, trademarks can be a sign, a name, a logo. It can be, actually, I read somewhere it could be a smell. I was like, really? I'm not sure about that. I think I have to check a bit more. And you can have a trademark. So trademark is what you sell your business with. Again, this is the differentiator. This is how people are going to be recognizing you versus your competitors. And this is what people pay money for, right? So they want the original Chanel handbag or the original, I don't know, something else, Ferrari. They don't want one that looks like it. They don't want one that says Chantel. They want, the Chanel one. So so by using a trademark, you acquire an unregistered trademark. However, it is quite difficult to enforce your rights. And of course, if you intend to develop into a new jurisdiction, you have not been using that name into the new jurisdiction, and therefore you do not have any rights in that particular jurisdiction, which is why it's useful to register trademarks. But it's also helpful to register your domain name to make sure your company has, the right name, although that doesn't have a legal impact. It just...
Can I just interrupt you a bit? Michael wants to add something to that.
Yeah, I was going to ask Laura a question, actually, just about trademarks. So I didn't want to interrupt your flow.
No, because it makes it much more interactive.
All right, okay. Well, I don't know. I'll say that.
Right, just go for
legal disclaimer about whether my question is actually going to be interesting.
Well, I decide that.
So
I'll stop you.
So I'm sure, my lord. So I have an interesting case on at the moment, Laura, which obviously shall remain unreferred to and nameless. What's happened in that case is you've got I'll call it an organisation, and it's a startup, and it has had great success, and it's we'll call it ABC. Okay, that's its acronym. Okay, so it's referred to as ABC. It's been in the press as ABC, and it has a democratic structure and the like. Okay, and as often happens in the startup, in life generally, but certainly with startups, is that there's been a falling out between two different constituencies. Okay, in this organisation, and what has happened because of this falling out is that the bad guys, as it were, have tried. I'm not going to rebut your inference, which is a fair one. Actually, it's a fair one, Laura. So you can't kid a commercial lawyer. So the bad guys, or the other side, as Laura rightly says, have tried to trademark ABC now, and they've put out on ABC's website. ABC is now changed to have TM above it, and communications are all rather amusingly, from my perspective, include the reference ABC TM. Okay, and I just wonder if you could just, because you're talking very helpfully about trademarks, if you could say something about, trademarking, how it works, what happens in that type of situation where you're a startup business, something goes wrong, you haven't actually, registered anything, and then people try and say, well, actually, that's my IP, that's my organisation, I'm going to claim it, and I'm going to say ABC's trademarked.
Yeah, so it's very frequent, and I don't want to be a bore about costs and about litigation. I was a litigator in a past life, and I left very quickly because I realised no one liked me. It was really annoying.
Sure,
even my clients didn't, If you won, they thought you were great for 2 weeks, and then they were we could have won it anyway. And if you lost, they were oh my God. So I kind of thought, let's do deals now and be on the good side.
Very interesting.
I guess the point I'd make is that it goes back to the foundations, right? If you set the foundations right, you don't have the problems. And this is why I find it so important when you have a limited budget. So startups don't have a lot of budget. And what they want is investment, okay? People will only invest if the startup has something that they own that they can sell, okay? They want to invest in something that is, it's not 100% revenue generator, but at least they're not investing in wind. They're investing in something that exists. So the problem is, when you start, quite often you have friends or acquaintances that have this brilliant idea, they get together and we're going to do this, it's brilliant. And then because there's so much to do for a startup, so much, you kind of think the legalese is it's a bit boring, and we're friends, right? So we don't really need to put in writing who owns what. I mean, we're two mates, maybe another mate from school will come and kind of help, build things up. But who had what idea, and do you have a shareholder agreement, and did you agree actually who developed what? Do you have employment contract that assigns any intellectual property to the company? So how does that work? So I think that my point is, what we want to try is, if we have a limited budget, we want to spend it on making sure we don't get into that kind of situation. Because afterwards, what can I tell you? It's horrible. It's a nightmare. You might lose your business. That's what happens. Real life, you waste time, you waste money, and you lose the business. You might be kicked out by your ex-best friend and lose your brand.
Okay.
Can I just, picking up on this idea of when you're being told over and over again, prepare better, set it up so that the problems don't arise. And of course, that's absolutely right. But talking just a moment ago about the setting up of the business itself, that extends into joint ventures, so for new capital with existing businesses. What can you do in parts of the world where potentially, bringing it back to corruption again, where there really are corruption risks, or one of your partners is in a place where this is a reality? I mean, corruption exists everywhere. We're lucky in this country not to have to bribe a police officer most of the time. But, you know, in terms of public procurement, corruption exists everywhere in all countries. But with joint ventures in particular, be cautious when you're dealing with parts of the world where corruption may be a real problem, as opposed to the sort of stuff I've just been mentioning. You can, particularly where there are local content and local ownership provisions. So if you're dealing with in a joint venture with a Chinese entity, there are local ownership rules there. And of course, the same is true in many parts of the MENA region where many of you are specifically dealing with. In those places, you can creatively set up voting rights and delegations to get round the fact that the company, the venture itself, might have to be predominantly or 51% minimum owned by that local entity. So you can be creative around these issues to manage corruption risks in that way. You can also build into joint venture agreements the fact that you, the entity with the greater exposure to the possibility of prosecution or civil litigation for corruption, that you, the entity in this jurisdiction, might in fact, under service level agreements, manage the supply chain. So there are various different ways that you might creatively think about managing corruption risks in an ongoing business beyond the
Gavin,
startup issues.
I was going to ask you, I mean, one of the areas you specialize in, this new term, which is called the doing health checks at what they call at-risk companies.
Yeah.
So can you just explain to us, because I think a lot of the people in this area might be doing business with countries which are currently considered potentially risky. You know, this at-risk, there are Iran and Syria and all that. Can you explain that area of your work, please?
Yes, certainly. But I mean, a health check is simply trying to assist a company that is already in existence, perhaps hasn't set up in the way that we would all like that to have happened, is exposed to risk, and coming along and saying, well, you can do this better. You don't have any policies and procedures in place. You've got to do that now, because if something happens, it's going to be, as we've already discussed, terribly expensive putting it right. So a health check is simply, you've got past the stage of setup and all those sorts of issues. Rather, you're dealing with an existing entity that needs some assistance with the reality of the risks that they're being exposed to. That's effectively it.
Well, thank you. I think you wanted to add something, Laura.
So many things. No, I'm joking.
Choose two.
Choose one. We have 2 minutes.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left.
No, just I think do your research. And I don't really like to be quoting Rumsfeld, but this is a really good one. The unknown unknown is really what tricks people. So just make sure you know more and that you know what you don't know. And that's the key thing. And it's so easy. I mean, Google IP for startups and you'll get lots of ideas about what you can and can't do. Some of them are quick and dirty, as I like to call them. Do the quick and dirty yourself. You don't need us. Like, we're there when it comes a bit more complicated, and you do need us at some stage, at different stages you do. But whatever you can do yourself, do it yourself. It's a startup by the end of the day. Whatever you don't know, learn. Google is amazing. And yeah, let us know afterwards if you have any questions.
May I thank my panel for being firstly with us on Saturday, having given up home, lawn mowing, barbecuing, and other important things for life. But thank you all for this brilliant contribution. Thank you, Gavin, Michael, and Laura. Thank you.
Thank you.